Right now, at this very moment, freight trains packed with Canadian grain are moving southward through American soil, cutting across state after state, passing through towns where farmers are barely keeping the lights on. But those trains aren't stopping. They aren't offloading at American terminals. They aren't fulfilling American export contracts. They are rolling straight through to Mexico, completely sidestepping the American grain trade system. And the United States, the nation that once had an iron grip on global grain markets, is watching that grip loosen in real time. I know how that sounds. I know some of you are thinking this has to be overblown, that someone is stretching the truth for clicks. But I am not speculating. This is not a theory. This is documented, verifiable, and happening right now in 2026. And if you give a damn about American agriculture, about trade power, about what happens to rural communities across this country, you need to sit with this because the consequences are already unfolding, and they are picking up speed faster than Washington seems willing to acknowledge. I'm going to walk you through every piece of this story because it is one of the most consequential shifts in North American trade we have seen in a generation, and it is barely getting the attention it deserves. Before we dive in, if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover exactly these kinds of stories every week, the ones that get buried, the ones the mainstream press glosses over. Subscribe now and let's get into it. Here is where it all begins. Back in 2023, a railroad deal was finalized that most Americans paid absolutely no attention to. Canadian Pacific Railway merged with Kansas City Southern, forming a new company called Canadian Pacific Kansas City, or CPKC. The price tag was $27 billion, and what came out of that deal was genuinely historic. It created the first and only single-line rail network spanning all three North American countries across roughly 20,000 miles of track. One railroad, one unbroken line running from Vancouver and Montreal in Canada down through the American interior, all the way to Lázaro Cárdenas on Mexico's Pacific coast. When the merger was being pitched, it sounded like a win for everyone. Deeper continental integration, smoother trade flows, more jobs, more economic activity across all three nations. But then the trade war arrived. When the Trump administration started rolling out tariffs in early 2025, initially 25% on most Canadian and Mexican imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the math changed entirely for Canadian grain exporters and the railroads that move their product. Suddenly, the United States was no longer just a trading partner. It had become a variable, and in the grain business, variables are dangerous. Commodity buyers require stable supply chains, predictable pricing, and the assurance that shipments will arrive without political disruption. Uncertainty is a deal killer. So Canada made a decision. It adapted. CPKC's chief executive, Keith Creel, started marketing his railroad in a completely different way, not just as a trade route, but as a land bridge, a mechanism that allows Canadian and Mexican companies to trade directly with each other while their cargo physically travels through United States territory without ever entering the American commercial system. No U.S. customs processing, no American port fees, no exposure to American tariffs. And this is entirely legal. Under existing bonded freight rules, goods can transit through the U.S. in a sealed, tracked condition and be delivered across the border without triggering duties or customs clearance. Because CPKC is the only railroad running a single continuous line through all three countries, it can move these bonded shipments with a speed and cost advantage that no competitor can match. No switching between rail companies, no interchange delays, no handoffs. Just one line, start to finish. In late March of 2025, a train carrying Canadian oats departed a mill north of Regina, Saskatchewan, and headed south into American territory. But it did not stop. It did not deliver to any American buyer. Even though the U.S. purchases around $500 million worth of Canadian oats every single year, that train kept moving. It crossed through the heartland and rolled straight into Mexico, delivering its cargo to Mexican buyers. It was the first ever single-line oat shipment from Canada directly to Mexico, And it was not just a business transaction, it was a statement, a clear, undeniable signal that the established order of North American grain trade was being redrawn. And it did not end with oats. CPKC began running Mexican produce northward into Canada as well. Fresh fruits and vegetables that Canadian grocery chains had long been sourcing from the United States. Loblaw Companies, one of Canada's biggest retail grocery operations, made a public announcement that it was actively replacing American-sourced products with Mexican alternatives. Mexico, having also been targeted by American tariffs, had every reason to build new trade corridors that left the U.S. out of the picture entirely. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely alarming for American agriculture and American economic influence. Canadian National Railway, CN, the other major Canadian rail carrier, also ramped up its operations significantly. CN committed to moving between 27 and 29.5 million metric tons of grain during the 2025 to 2026 crop year. Total Western Canadian grain movement was projected to reach around 31 million metric tons, nearly 1 million metric tons above the previous all-time record. At the same time, CPKC announced more than 500 million Canadian dollars in new capital investment. They bought high-capacity bulk rail cars. They took delivery of 100 new Tier 4 diesel-electric locomotives in 2025 alone. And in December of 2024, they finished construction of a second cross-border rail bridge at the Nuevo Laredo crossing, named the Patrick J. Ottman International Railway Bridge, eliminating a long-standing bottleneck that the old single-track span had created. This is not blueprint infrastructure. This is physical, operational, in-the-ground reality. Steel laid, engines running, grain moving through corridors that simply did not exist 2 years ago. Then, in November of 2025, Canada rolled out an electronic phytosanitary certification system for grain exports destined for Mexico, cutting processing time and reducing fraud risk throughout the supply chain. It sounds like dry regulatory housekeeping, but it is actually one of the most important moves in this whole story, because what it does is make Canada-Mexico trade faster, smoother, and more reliable. And that institutional reliability is precisely what international grain buyers want. Once those systems are in place, those trade patterns calcify. They become the default. They become the expectation. The downstream effect is that Canadian grain is now more price competitive in markets where American grain used to be dominant. More efficient rail corridors mean lower delivered costs, which forces American exporters to squeeze their margins even thinner just to stay in the conversation, or they lose the business altogether. And this is all happening against a backdrop of an American agricultural trade position that is deteriorating at a pace that should shock every single person watching this. Here are the numbers, and they are brutal. For most of modern history, the United States ran a consistent surplus in agricultural trade, selling far more food and farm products to the world than it brought in. That era is done. In 2023, the U.S. ran an agricultural trade deficit of $16.7 billion. In 2024, that figure nearly doubled to $31.8 billion. And the USDA projected the fiscal year 2025 deficit would climb to approximately $49.5 billion, the worst agricultural trade imbalance ever recorded in American history. From January through April of 2025 alone, the United States imported $78.22 billion in agricultural products, while exporting just $58.5 billion, a gap of nearly $20 billion in 4 months. For soybeans specifically, the 2025 to 2026 marketing year saw U.S. exports fall to their lowest level in 13 years. America's share of global soybean trade dropped to a record low of just 23%. A decade ago, that figure was close to 40%. China, which had been the single largest driver of American soybean demand for years, dramatically pivoted toward Brazil and Argentina, countries that invested heavily in both production capacity and transportation infrastructure, and that were not using tariff threats as diplomatic tools. And it is not only soybeans. U.S. corn exports were also projected to fall as South American producers expanded output and grabbed growing demand across Southeast Asia and other developing regions. The macro picture is devastating. More than 312,000 family farms have disappeared since 1997. Agribusiness consolidation is accelerating while the small and mid-sized operations that defined rural America keep getting squeezed out. The USDA projects that the cost of producing a single acre of corn will reach $915 in 2026, up from $897 the year before, while average revenue from that acre is falling below break-even, leaving farmers absorbing losses exceeding $100 per acre. The National Corn Growers Association has publicly called this an economic crisis hitting rural America. The American Soybean Association sent a letter to the administration warning that U.S. soybean farmers are standing at a trade and financial precipice. These are not advocacy groups with a political agenda. These are the organizations that represent the farmers growing the food that this country and the world depends on, and they are sounding the alarm. Now, layered on top of all of this is a legal earthquake that shook the entire trade policy landscape on February 20th, 2026. The United States Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 ruling in Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump, finding that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, joined by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Jackson. The court held that the power to levy tariffs is a branch of the taxing authority explicitly assigned to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. The majority concluded that IEEPA's language authorizing the president to regulate imports does not include the imposition of tariffs, and that no prior president had ever interpreted the law that way. The ruling dismantled the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, struck down the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs that had been placed on practically every U.S. trading partner, and effectively voided the central legal instrument the administration had been using to prosecute its entire trade war. The Tax Foundation estimated those IEEPA tariffs had already collected over $160 billion and would have generated $1.4 trillion through 2035. Over 1,000 businesses had already submitted applications for tariff refunds before the ruling even came down. The administration moved within hours. The president signed a proclamation invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, setting tariffs initially at 10% before raising them to 15% the following day, which is the statutory ceiling under that law. But here is the detail that matters. Section 122 tariffs are capped at 150 days and require congressional authorization for any extension. They were designed for a completely different era, specifically balance of payments crises under the gold standard framework. Multiple legal scholars are already challenging the validity of applying Section 122 to current conditions. 24 states filed suit contesting the Section 122 tariffs in March of 2026. Treasury Secretary Bessent stated publicly that layering Section 122 with Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs would produce roughly the same revenue picture in 2026. But that statement itself exposes what is actually happening. The administration is in scramble mode, hunting for alternative legal pathways to preserve a tariff structure that the Supreme Court just ruled was illegal to begin with. Meanwhile, the harm to America's trade relationships is already locked in. You cannot spend over a year threatening your two closest trading partners with punishing tariffs, actually enforce those tariffs, watch the Supreme Court declare them constitutionally invalid, and then expect those partners to act as if none of it happened. Canada has absorbed the lesson, Mexico has absorbed the lesson, and the infrastructure investments both countries are pouring into new trade routes and direct bilateral relationships that cut the United States out of the loop. Those are not going to be reversed by a court opinion. The CPKC corridor exists. The locomotives are on the tracks. The certification systems are live. The trade contracts are being signed. Over 94% of Canadian grain exported abroad travels by rail. Whoever shapes those rail corridors shapes the flow of that grain, and Canada is aggressively investing to make sure those corridors serve Canadian interests above all else. A March 2026 poll from the Angus Reid Institute found that 51% of Americans believe there should be no tariff at all on Canadian goods, up from 42% during the 2024 campaign. Even within the MAGA Republican base, more respondents preferred a minor tariff on Canada at 48% than a major one at just 20%. The American public's instincts are running ahead of the policy, and the economic data is validating those instincts. But this story is bigger than any single court ruling or any single trade policy cycle. What is really happening here is a structural erosion of the United States' position in global grain markets. Brazil has dramatically expanded soybean output through productivity gains and massive government logistics investment, and has solidly overtaken the U.S. as the world's top soybean exporter. Argentina locked in permanent reductions to its agricultural export taxes in December 2025 and is on track to post its second largest wheat export volume ever. Russia, Ukraine, Australia, and Romania are all expanding their share of global grain supply. Production growth worldwide is outpacing demand growth, and the competition among exporting nations is intensifying every single season. Industry leaders in American grain trade have made it clear that the current situation is unlike anything the sector has faced before, and that the only way forward is for U.S. exporters to urgently diversify their customer base both internationally and domestically before the window to act closes entirely. USMCA is up for review in 2026, and the administration's chief trade negotiator, Jameson Greer, has reportedly told Canadian media that Canada should accept elevated tariffs on its exports to the U.S. while simultaneously opening its dairy market to American producers. Canada is not going to swallow that without pushing back hard, and Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office after Justin Trudeau stepped down, has been projecting a far more assertive posture on trade, including negotiating a new deal with China that drew a threat of 100% tariffs from President Trump in response. The average American tariff on Canadian products has risen from 0.1% to 5.8% over the past year. Canadian exports have softened as a result. But Canada is not sitting on its hands. It is redirecting its trade flows, building new corridors, and signaling clearly that it intends to reduce its dependency on the American market, not deepen it. Consider the scale of what is at stake in this relationship. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. Every single day, roughly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services cross that border. About 60% of American crude oil imports come from Canada, so do 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. This is not a country you take on carelessly in a trade conflict. And yet, here we are. The United States is simultaneously pushing away its most important trading partner, hemorrhaging global grain market share to South American and Black Sea competitors, watching its agricultural trade deficit balloon to record-breaking levels, losing family farms at an accelerating rate, and navigating a Supreme Court ruling that has thrown the entire legal architecture of its tariff strategy into disarray. And the railroads, the actual physical infrastructure of continental trade, are being rebuilt in ways that serve Canada's diversification strategy, not America's leverage. Every new locomotive CPKC adds to its fleet. Every ton of grain that moves from Saskatchewan to Mexico without touching an American export terminal. Every certification system that makes Canada-Mexico commerce faster and more frictionless is another element of a structure being built around the United States rather than through it. This is what happens when trade policy is built on threats and volatility rather than on strategic partnership and predictable rules. Markets do not wait for politicians to sort things out. Farmers do not wait. Railroad companies do not wait. Grain buyers in Mexico, in Asia, in Africa do not wait. They find alternatives. They build infrastructure. They sign long-term contracts. And once those new patterns are established and embedded into logistics networks and trade agreements, reversing them is extraordinarily difficult. The question every American needs to be asking right now is not whether tariffs are philosophically right or wrong. Thoughtful people can debate that. The question is whether the way this trade war has been conducted has actually achieved any of its stated goals: stronger American manufacturing, reduced trade deficits, better outcomes for American workers. Look at the results. The agricultural trade deficit is at an all-time high. Family farms are disappearing faster than before. Grain export market share is shrinking. Our closest trading partner is actively engineering infrastructure to route commerce around us. And the Supreme Court has now ruled that the legal foundation of this entire trade war was unconstitutional from day one. Those are not opinions. They are not partisan talking points. They are documented, verifiable, real-world results affecting real American families every single day. The farmers who are up before sunrise working land that has been in their families for generations deserve trade policy that is deliberate, consistent, and built to help them compete in a global market that is getting more competitive every year. Not policy that generates chaos, isolates allies, and hands market share to rivals on a silver platter. I want to know what you think. Leave it in the comments. Do you think this trade war strategy is delivering results? What do you think needs to change to protect American farmers and American grain export power? What would you say to the farmer in your county looking at another year in the red? If you watched this far, you care about the real story behind the headlines, and I genuinely appreciate that. Hit subscribe if you haven't, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next one.